Again, welcome, and we're glad that you're here today. Today, we are going to be focusing in on just the actual building process of a compost pile. This is kind of related to our earlier presentation in May, and so this presentation will really just focus on that aspect of it. I do want to start off by just saying that there are 3 different ways of managing plant and food scraps in Thurston County. You can have them picked up at your curb via the organic bin and a curbside pickup situation. You can also self-haul it over to the Waste and Recovery Center, which is in Hawks Prairie, or you can actually do some composting at home. And so that's what today we're going to focus in on that aspect of it. As well as, I'll just let you know that we're not going into the greater depths of how to actually compost. The parameters before that were also discussed in the May 6th presentation, and there is a recording of that on our extension website. So if you were the follow-up link will be provided in the follow-up resources, but you can also just Google WSU Extension Thurston County and then click on the Master Recycler Composter page on the site, and it has a listing of all of the different workshops from the Lunch and Learns and the recordings to those. So there might be a couple different spots in the presentation where I'm not really familiar with the process or I need more information. I would highly recommend to go back to this presentation that happened during International Composting Awareness Week back in May 6th and watch that presentation that gives you more of the background reasons why the science is actually happening in the composting process. Today we're going to focus on doing a quick review about some of those basic terms and items that are needed in order for us to build a pile. But our focus for today's Lunch and Learn is really just the actual presentation of actually building a pile. So let's review what compost is just to make sure we're all on the same page. Again, it's simply a combination of yard debris like grass clippings or fallen leaves and or kitchen scraps such as food or vegetable spoils that are separated from the waste stream and placed into an environment suitable for decomposition. And as a result, we used it to fertilize our soil and make those enhancements. So the one thing I do want to keep in mind is that composting is variable, and it's based on science, and it's kind of like if you're thinking about like a cake, you can make a bunch of different methods for baking a cake. There are lots of different recipes for it. Same thing for compost. It depends on what kind of compost you have is based on the inputs, what kind of things you're adding to it. And so each time that's the moisture content's a little different, the materials are a little different, and so your compost will come out a little bit different each time. So yes, we're going to provide you a recipe today, but just keep in mind that that recipe is variable based on the types of materials that you do want to compost at your house. So before you again begin composting, so for those that already have a bin or those that are looking to actually start one, there's really 3 questions you need to ask yourself before you actually start a compost pile. And the critical piece is how much space do you have? That will determine what kind of bin size if you choose to actually have a bin, what size you need, but also how much space that you have dedicated to actual compost. And that can be variable. Do you live in a single family home with a bit of a yard where you're able to actually compost in a designated spot? Do you have acreage where you have lots of space and you need higher volume style of a compost bin in order to process that? Or do you live in a high rise and maybe you can do some worm composting on your balcony? So the method of composting is based on the space in which you live and have. How much waste do you have? That's the second question. That will also help determine what method is best for composting for you as well. So at some times of the year, there might be where you'll have a stockpile of a certain material, but not something else. And so making sure that you have enough material and how much do you produce will also help you determine the best method. So again, a person that lives by themselves has a different waste amount compared to somebody that has, a family of 2 to a family of 4. And so that will also help us determine what type of method would work best for you. And then the other thing you need to evaluate is what materials would you like to compost at home? For some, it's very cut and dry. They're like, yeah, I want to do grass clippings, or I want to do my yard flower beds. So anything that was grown there that, spoiled vegetables or deadheading of plants, then all of that material could be considered. Other folks just want to do food scraps, and maybe a worm bin is a better choice for you. But today we're going to actually focus in on one method that is using a bin. But the same thing can be applicable to a no bin system as well. So you want to also review what can I compost at home. This section, again, I go into greater depth in the May presentation. So again, if you have questions about some of this material, I would go back and review that presentation just so that you can get some of that clarification done. But again, this is just some sample examples of things that you could do in a home system. The biggest thing I think most folks are looking for is here, the fruit and vegetable matter, the yard debris, and the lawn clippings from there. And then you have some other things that you might also, coffee grounds, eggshells, tea bags, wood chips, that you could also compost those things in a home setting as well. So what can't you compost at home? This is again a short list here of some of the items. And traditionally, I'll say that when we've had questions come into our question and answer clinic about problems with their compost, as we are asking questions back and forth, we tend to find out that the reason why the pile isn't doing well is because some of the stuff that is actually on this that what we shouldn't be composting is actually being done at that a particular space. So the best thing to do is to actually make sure that we review this before we start our pile, so that way we're not actually we're going to be setting ourselves up more for success rather than having to deal with the problem. So really make sure that you're just doing your fruit and vegetable scraps. Again, meats, oils, and dairy food waste should not go in a home system. They can go into a commercial system. So if you had a yard waste bin, you can put those meats and dairy items in there, and then they go to a commercial facility, which tends to get much hotter in temperature. And so they can break down those harder to break down items, things that are coated in oils and have grease on them, compared to a home system where that's just going to traditionally stall your pile and also attract rodents and other critters. So that's the one main thing that we tend to see a lot of. The other thing too is you want to only put in certain weeds as well, especially if they've already gone to seed. That's not a good thing to be putting them into your compost pile at home. The temperatures don't get hot enough. And then there's some other things about disease plants, which we're going to get to in a second. Limited citrus and cedar. That's again because these are natural antibacterial killers, and I go into a big description about that in the May 6th presentation as well. So you can go back and read some of that as well. Okay, so if you have questions about that, what these question slides, when they pop up, they'll just as a reminder that you can type in a question that you might have about any of the material I just presented into the Q&A function, and then the next time the question slide comes up, we'll answer some of those. So we'll keep moving on, but again, if you have a question about that information, please type it in the Q&A box. All right, so let's quickly review the composting process, just so again, we're all on the same page. If you look at the composting process as a car, there's really three parts of it in order for it to happen successfully. One, you would be the operator. Compost will happen naturally on its own, but you being introduced to the composting process will actually speeds up the process. And so that is, especially if you're doing a hot composting system, you are a critical piece to the success of that pile. Your fuel that you would normally run a car on is considered organic waste. So again, that's fruit and vegetable scraps, tree trimmings, spent flour, those kind of items there. And in order for this to be broken down, you need the engine, which is the microherd, and that's all the bacteria, the fungi, the worms, the arthropods, etc. So you need all three of these things in order for our composting process to happen, just like you need all these three things for a car to run. Okay, so we have some main composting examples. There's a passive system, which is basically minimal human interaction with the compost, or a hot system where you are actually a critical piece to that composting process. There's also vermicomposting, which is done by worms as well as bokashi. These we're not going to talk about today. We're just going to focus in on these two things, the cold and the hot. All right, so if we were going to start with the cold system here, this is traditionally what you would see for a cold system, which basically you just throw the items on a pile and in basically 2 years, if I was to basically dump all of our grass material and other types of spent plant material on that pile, it would take about 2 years for it to fully compost out. And that's with very minimal interaction. It's just you leaving in the pile to be there. If you happen to turn it every now and then or water it a little bit, it might speed up a little bit, but really the whole goal of a cold system is that you just dump the stuff in there, and then eventually, about 2 years, if you were to dig at the bottom of that pile, you'd have actually finished compost. It costs less because you don't need anything, you just need the space. And again, you're doing minimal work in it. And basically, yeah, you have a process that's just naturally going to happen. So as far as the cold, again, up to 2 years, best for yard waste, not food waste, just because it's so exposed to the environment. And especially if you live in an area that has lots of critters or rodents there, that's definitely not a good spot to be having a cold system there. But lawn clippings, other tree limbs and things like that are perfect for those types of cold piles. You're not restricted by a pile size. There's a greater diversity of organisms and nutrients just because that pile is in contact with the soil, and the bacteria in that tend to move up and down throughout the pile compared to that of the soil. And really it's little labor is established, so basically it's not needed from there. The only downside is that weed seeds and diseases may survive because the composting process does not heat up hot enough in order to kill some diseases and weed seeds. Okay, here is the hot system, and the theory of using a hot composting system is that U plus turning plus moisture equals an increased rate of decomposition. And so when you're looking at a hot system, you're typically looking or using a bin in order for that to happen. And most of the bins are a traditional 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet in size. So again, you monitoring this space, turning it, adding moisture to it will increase the rate of decomposition, which will speed up the normal decomposition process. So overall, it typically takes about 4 to 6 months for that to happen. It does require you to be a part of that process, meaning you could be in there. If you want the composting process in a relatively short period of time, you need to be part of that process in making sure that it's watered properly and that you're turning it. You could use a bin as a cold compost process by just throwing the stuff in and not touching it for 2 years and seeing how much of it actually just breaks down on its own. But really, when you're talking a bin, most folks use it in a hot system, which means that they're out there watering it, they're turning it, and ultimately the size of that pile is correct, which is about 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. If you have too big of a pile, the pile can stall in a hot system, or if you have too small of a pile, it can also stall. So really, you can have multiple piles, but 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet is ultimately the size of that is best. Typically the temperatures do get hotter initially, and they will go above 140 degrees, which actually can kill some weed seeds. The commercial systems will go even up higher than that to 500-600 degrees or more. And so they can really kill at a commercial facility, kill off those diseases. Where in a home system, you're not looking at anything more than 160 to 170 degrees as what your target temperatures are. The only thing also with the downside of a hot system is that it can kill off some beneficial organisms there. And it's good for food and yard waste because there is some kind of protection between the environment and the critters. So, in a hot system, do you need a container? The answer is you don't. Is typically yes, it helps. But in order to compost, you don't need one. Again, you could just put it in a pile that could operate as a cold system, and it would compost just naturally in about 2 years. These bins all have, will help speed up the process, and they all have different pros and cons. And so we also have the plastic bin styles, we also have wire mesh, we have pallets or wooden cement blocks are another method that's typically used for a composting structure. But these are all considered hot ways in order to hot compost. Where the pile is considered the cold system. So you don't need one to compost, but again, if you want it faster, these bins do help. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is how to actually build them. So if you want to go on our website, we have a compost bin pro and con handout. So all of these, as I said, all have pros and cons. And so we have listed them out with the style and then the pro of that style bin and the con of that bin. And then you can make a better informed decision about whether or not which bin would work best for you. And you can always contact us too if you have questions about that. So definitely go to our website and check out this handout, and it also will be in your follow-up email that'll come after this webinar. Okay, do we have any questions? Or if not, if you have more questions about that, you can also type them into the Q&A box.
We do have some questions.
Okay.
A few questions on, you mentioned no dirt into the compost. Could you elaborate?
You want to have, you can, when you're first building a pile, you do want to add a scoop, depending on the size of what pile you're building, you can add some soil in order to get the microorganisms in that soil established into your pile. But if you add too much dirt ongoing after that, too much dirt can actually stall the decomposition process. So again, initially a little bit of soil is fine. And you could put a ratio of that. For example, when we watch the video, you'll see like a bucket of material put in. You could put a bucket in of soil to start your pile, but then after that, really it's not necessary unless you have problems with your pile longer, and then you can use it as a way to restart your pile. So soil really shouldn't be a major part of the composting process. It's used in order to get the organisms that are breaking down the material into your pile initially, or to re-energize it if it happens to stall out.
Okay, next is, even though you're not going into detail, what is bokashi composting?
Bokashi composting is an anaerobic system. So everything that we're talking about today involves oxygen as being a critical piece to the success of composting. Bokashi composting is actually lack of oxygen, or an anaerobic process, and that you don't want oxygen in it. So it's just a different method. And traditionally with bokashi, you're talking about food composting. So it's normally just done with food scraps, but you're actually trying to remove the oxygen in a bokashi system. So it's two different ways of processing food.
Okay, next, how much and how often should I water in my 3x3 bin? Is there an easy way to turn in this bin? I've just been using it cold composting.
Okay, so let's hold off on that because I think you're going to see the video of us doing that, and I'll explain a little bit more of that once that video pops up. So let's hold on to that question.
Okay, and then last question for right now. Would placing a tarp over a cold system help speed and heat up the compost?
It is helpful in the winter time, especially if it's very wet. You're going to have a lot of runoff, and the tarp will help protect that cold composting system. That being said, you don't want to have it so tight that some oxygen still can't get into that pile. In fact, in a cold system, actually, I'm going to talk about that in aerating as well. So actually, I'll show a picture, because when I show that picture, I'll be able to explain it more. So I'm going to come back to that question as well.
Okay, that wraps up the questions right now. If you have more questions, please use the Q&A function, and we'll get to them at the next questions section.
Great. Okay, let's move on then. All right, so it's time to build our compost pile. So if you have, if you're starting from a hot system, the first and foremost thing you want to make sure is that you decide which bin style is best for you. And so in our demonstration garden at Dirtworks, as well as our closed loop demonstration garden, we have examples of different types of bin styles. Currently right now, Closed Loop Park, which is at the Waste and Recovery Center, we have a demonstration garden there, and we demonstrate different methods of composting there. And that is currently open to the public anytime that the Waste and Recovery Center is open. And that is also, those times are listed on our website as well. Our other facility, which you're going to see the pictures are from today, we're taking at our Dirtworks demonstration garden, which is in Yager Park across from the Capitol Mall. And that's typically where we hold our workshops. So next year, when we have back in-person workshops, we invite you to come out there and we can show you the different pros and cons also of the different bin styles there. Unfortunately, that garden is not open to the public right now. We're still working through our COVID procedures from there. So right now it is not open yet. So hopefully soon. So if you're starting from square one, I would say as a reminder, just remember that you want to pick a location that is best for you. And you want to make sure that it's in a spot where It's not too far where you're not going to use it, but it's also not too close to someplace where you use all the time, because one, it could be unsightly. Sometimes, for example, you're stockpiling things and it just kind of looks more messy. So if you're going to have, if you have your entertaining area, let's say in your deck, maybe having your compost pile right next to your deck is not the best spot. Maybe behind the garage or at the back part of your yard where you're not having to see it right there while you're entertaining. But otherwise, I've also heard too that some people put it out so far in their yard that in the wintertime, they didn't want to actually walk out there to it because it was too far. And so that also diminishes the use of the pile too. So you have to figure out what's best. So I've also heard of folks have worm bins right on their deck, under like an arbor or something that will keep them protected a little bit out of the sun. There's also worm bin coffee tables, so you could actually compost inside your home as well. And so making that decision about where you're going to put it is also a critical spot to your success. So also, if your bin does come with a bottom, sometimes you buy a bin and it has a black plastic piece at the very bottom of the compost pile or bin. Most of the time, if they do come with them, we encourage you not to actually use it. What that means is set your bin up, but don't use that little flat piece of plastic that comes with, that's supposed to be at the base of your bin. The reason why is that you want the soil organisms to be able to move freely up and down throughout your pile. And by putting that plastic base on, you're actually inhibiting the bacteria and the fungus from going back and forth and doing its natural job. So even if you get one, and a lot of the bin styles that I'll be showing here in a second come with them automatically, we just encourage you to find a different use for it, but not actually use it in your bin. If you have problems with rodents, you could use hardware cloth or a wire, so that would prevent it would still allow the bacteria and fungus to move freely, but won't inhibit having the mice come into your pile or voles or moles, whatever you have. All right, so let's so we're getting ready to build. So we've got our location here, and now you need to make sure that you have your tools. And so there is a video. Also in the follow-up email will be a link to our YouTube channel. We created little couple-minute videos about each of the different processes in order to get your compost pile ready. We do cover one that goes through all of these different tools. So we're not going to play that right now because we're going to watch some other videos that we want to encourage, but some things that go through the exact reasons why you would need certain of these types of tools. Again, shovels, rakes, pitchfork or manure fork is highly valuable. Access to water, again, that's the best location if you're trying to pick where to put your pile. Making sure that it has access to water is a critical step. So don't put it out someplace where you're going to have to, bucket yourself water back to it. You need to have access to a hose to it. The other critical piece, a tarp is a great way to collect your items around as you're deadheading and cutting things from your beds, putting it onto the tarp and then dragging it over to your compost pile. That's an easy way, or using a wheelbarrow. Buckets can also be that collecting venue as well. We do have sifters or composting screens. We're going to talk about those in a minute. Hand pruners, saws are also helpful. A composting thermometer, if you really want to get into it. You can see how hot your compost pile is heating up. They do sell them. They're about 3 feet, at least 2.5, 3 feet in length. And that has a long probe and it goes into your pile and you're able to then track the temperatures of your compost. The critical piece with all of this, I would say, is wear gloves, wear long sleeves, and wear sensible shoes, as well as long pants are highly recommended. There are pathogens that can be spread through compost. And so by using those protective gear on there will help protect you from those particular entities. Especially if you have cuts on your hands and then, some bacteria gets into it, you'll have less of a chance for getting infected with that. Okay, so let's begin with bacteria and fungi are eating the organic material. So again, leaves, all kinds of spent, fruit and vegetable scraps, etc. And they're broken down into 2 main categories. So here we have the carbons. The carbons are for they're the carbohydrates for the decomposers. They're considered browns, even though there are carbon sources that are not brown. So it doesn't really have to do with color. It's just a name that's given to them, and they're considered the bulking agents. Where nitrogen, Those are the proteins to build strong bodies for the decomposers. So those are, again, to help build the bodies of the bacteria and the fungus. And they're considered greens. And they are typically those that provide the energy to those particular, to the composting process. So if we're looking at the two groups there, again, you need carbon sources and you need nitrogen sources. And you need to have a ratio of that in order for the compost to actually work properly. And that recipe is 1 green to 2 browns plus air and water equals compost. So that that's basically the secret recipe for successful compost, whatever your ratio is. So it could be a bucket, it could be a shovel full, it could be a pitchfork full, it could be a truckload full, it could be a wheelbarrow full. The measurement is whatever you're using, 1 wheelbarrow of green material to 2 wheelbarrows of brown materials plus air and water equals compost. And so really this is the critical thing to remember when building a pile. All right, so now we're going to move over and actually see 2 of the videos that we filmed in our demonstration garden. And you'll be able to watch them, and I'll narrate the first one, and the other one's got speaking attached to it. So this one here is examples of browns and greens. So what we're watching right now is our stockpile of browns or carbons. Examples of this are wood chips, sawdust, spent leaves, straw, cardboard, old coffee grounds, and small twigs and chips. And then you'll see also, as we moved to the right here, we've got in our green collection, which is also considered our nitrogen sources. And that could be fresh grass clippings, fruit and vegetable scraps, tea bags, weeds without seeds, fresh coffee grounds, some manures, chicken, alpaca, rabbit are all great manures for compost. Dog and cat are not. So those are the ones you don't want to put into your compost pile because of the high pathogen levels that they have. As well as other nitrogen sources include some eggshells and some citrus are fine as well. So here in this leaf, we've got also, if we had a branch come down from a conifer tree or fern fronds, we've got spent peas here that have, passed their growth there. They're typically a spring plant. So by midsummer, they're already looking pretty ragged. So you can pull those out and that could be considered a green. We've got some chewed up kale leaves there, a radish that got eaten by some little critter below. Grass leaves there, and a whole bunch of other kind of other types of spent flower blooms. So those are all examples of greens, which are considered our nitrogen source. Okay, so now we're going to move into our next video of how to build a pile.
Okay, we're ready to build our pile now, and the best way to do that is to make sure that all your supplies are needed. All the supplies you needed are here. So you want to make sure you have your stockpile of browns and you also have your stockpile of greens. And then we're going to use what we call our ideal recipe for making compost. And that is based on a measurement. So for this video purposes, we're showing you that the buckets, it's basically 2 buckets of brown materials for 1 bucket of green material. So in order to build your pile, you're going to actually add the 2 buckets of brown material, add your bucket of green material, and you're going to start building that ratio. And again, the point of that is that moisture, the greens tend to be contain more moisture, so the browns balance that out so that it doesn't get too soupy. The other part about with this size compost pile is that traditionally a bucket might not work for you. It might be best actually to use a pitchfork instead because of the size of the bucket. If you were using a plastic compost bin, then maybe using a bucket method works better because the mouth of the compost bin is smaller. But for this size that we have, this cement block type of compost pile, that would be considered 1 brown to 1 green, and then add another brown, and then you're going to mix and water. So once you keep doing that, repeating and repeating, and water as you go, and that ultimately you'll have that perfect recipe for compost. Okay, we're ready to build.
Okay. Okay, so I want to thank Ralph and Joe. Both of them are Master Recycler Composter volunteers, and they were our fabulous examples of helpers with building our composting example pile. So thank you to them. So one thing I didn't mention in that particular video is that you want to avoid putting in a lot of diseased or plant material into your compost pile. If you see that the plant is really covered in insects or is heavily diseased, typically there may be a chance where those particular plants will break down. Let's say this particular leaf had spores on it from a specific disease. Those spores sometimes don't break down in a compost, in a home system. So what happens is those spores are just lay dormant in that compost. And then next year what would happen is you'd put that compost back out into your flower beds, and now that pathogen is still in the soil, and certain pathogens, that's how they reproduce or thrive. And so it's best if you have really anything that's diseased or heavily insect there to put that stuff in the trash, or send it to your curbside organics, which then in that case they can go to a commercial facility where that stuff is then heated up to a much hotter temperature to kill those spores. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that it's really difficult to kill some persistent diseases in a home system. So it's best to separate those out and bag them out, or put them in your trash instead. Okay, questions? If you either have some, you can type them in, or if we have any others about the greens and browns and also the ratios there.
Yeah, one question, does the pile need to be in the sun?
No, it doesn't. In fact, being in the sun can actually be a deterrent for some, because especially during the hot summers, because it dries out quicker and you just have to monitor that water use. But yes, it can be done in the shade, or it can be done in the sun, and anything in between as well. Just know that if you have it in the sun, you're going to have to monitor the moisture level way more than you would if it's in the shade.
And one question, I'm going to read it here. I keep a 5-gallon bucket near the house for acceptable composting food items. That bucket generally doesn't get dumped on the compost until it's full. A couple times it was pretty much a stinky liquid. We dumped it on the compost while wondering if we really should at this point.
Yes, you can, but you're exactly showing what happens to the greens. So that bucket is full of primarily green material, which is your nitrogen sources, and they tend to, as they break down, become very liquid and soupy. So that's why the ratio is 1 green to 2 browns, because you need the browns as a bulking agent in order to balance that moisture content, so that it's a good ratio between that. So you're not having things be too liquefied or too dried out.
Okay, and then we also had a request for the references to be posted. They're not able to find the references that you're talking about, the resources you're talking about, Corey. So I'm going to post a link in the chat, and you can use that link to go directly to the website, and that link will also be in the follow-up materials. So.
Yes, yep, that's great. Okay, so we'll keep moving. Again, if you have more questions, keep them coming. We'll get to the next question section. So, all right, so with building a pile, there is a mixing and aerating video on our YouTube channel that you can also go in and watch, just those specific little short videos about mixing and aerating. But for this presentation, we're just going to go over a couple slides about that. The critical piece that is also important to this, and why we also suggested that you have pruners as well as maybe a handsaw or loppers, is to break things down. So you need some structure in your pile, but you don't need to have big massive branches. So if you take out a big limb from, let's say, a pruning project, you want to break those down into more 2 or 3 foot sections, and then you could put those pieces anything or smaller. You need some structure. So for example, in this particular pile there, I would probably leave and add a couple bigger branches, because it does provide some structure for that pile in order to keep air circulating. Sometimes if you just have all grass we all know what happens when you just pile grass up upon grass, and eventually that becomes a stinky, slimy mess. So by adding some other leaves and other, whether it be straw or other types of material in there, that helps absorb that so that those ratios don't become too liquefied. And by providing a little bit of support, it helps with that aerating as well. So breaking things down into more manageable sizes will help the composting process, and you'll get finished compost faster. If you're doing cold compost, it doesn't matter. You don't have to spend the time breaking things down because it'll just take its time. But if you want hot system, breaking those things down into more manageable pieces, into smaller pieces, will help to speed up the process. By doing that, by breaking those up, the 3 Bs, the bruising, the bashing, and breaking, that actually helps with the next thing, which is then you're going to water and then mix it, which will then provide oxygen to the pile, which will then produce warmth. So what happens is, as those bacteria and fungus are eating, they're actually releasing energy out in the form of heat. And so that's what happens to why you'll see a temperature rise in your pile. And so the other balance part is that you need that oxygen for them to still, do their job, as well as that right water ratio there. So you want both the right oxygen and water level, so that way the warmth is produced by those bacteria and fungus. So again, getting into your pile, there's a couple different methods there. Now, some bins have a square opening at the top, and that's easier in order to get either a pitchfork, or here, this is another tool called the compost turner. If you look at this, it's kind of a long rod here, and it has these little maneuvered levers there. So basically, when you're pushing it down, the levers come up, and then what happens is, as you're doing a turning motion, the levers come down and actually help break in and aerate the pile so that it doesn't become this big solid mass. So that's one way to help, especially if you have a more narrow opening to a bin. That's one way to help turn and aerate. The other part about that, you could also use sticks in that. You could do a PVC pipe in order to, so what you would do is you'd build the bin, and then right instead of where this tool would be, you'd put a PVC pipe that had holes drilled into it in order to help get air into the center of the pile. So it's kind of like a smokestack. It would just be like a little smokestack of a PVC pipe kind of sticking up with some holes in it. And what happens is the top of that tube is above the lid liner, or lid level of the bin, and so that oxygen can get down to the center of the pile. It's also another way to water the pile as well. So you could actually use that same PVC pipe, put your hose down in, and then you're getting water into the center of the pile, which also helps in it being easier for you to turn it. So here's an example. Here's like a outdoor type of bin, but they put PVC pipe drilled with holes in it. And see, right now they're using this to get oxygen into this larger bin. But as I said, you can also put your hose in here too and use it as a watering. So what happens is the water goes down in here, and then below the surface, everywhere there's a hole, the water goes out. So that's one way. In a commercial system, they use inflatable tubes. So these would normally be flat. They pile all the material on it, and then what happens is once the material's on, they pipe air into it and they inflate. And so then it's a constant source of oxygen that's being fed throughout that pile. Our system, the way that we use in Silver Springs Organics, which is our local facility in Rainier where our curbside organics collection bins goes, they have actually holes drilled into the cement floor or the flooring, so that way then the air comes up through the floor. And so as the pile of materials are on top of it, this is getting oxygenated by air that's being forced up through the actual floor of the facility. So there's lots of different ways of getting air into your pile. If you don't necessarily, if you're physically able not to turn it yourself, these are some other ways of trying to get oxygen into your pile. But the best way of getting air into the pile is actually being able to mix it. All right, so we're going to move into watering and finished compost video. Okay, so with watering, one other way that is helpful is that in order to keep, especially like these bins here are in the sun. So what we do is we put a layer of cardboard on the top of that, and we wet it down, and that's another way, another layer in order to help keep that moisture in. The other thing about this particular bin is that the corners tend to dry out a lot more than the center does. So whenever we're watering, that is another way that we make sure that we spend, making sure that that water really gets down into the cornered sections there, and that also helps with turning. Now this particular bin is layered, and so you're able to take off in segments the bin, and actually you could move it to another location right next to it. And that way it's sometimes easier in order to mix the stuff. Where other times I could just put a composting fork in there and actually just twist it and turn it, or use a pitchfork and try to really mix that up. It is a little bit more challenging to do it that way. One of the #1 problems we have with compost piles here in the Pacific Northwest is people underwatering their pile. The amount, as you can see, how much water they're actually putting it on. When you're starting a bin, you want to make sure that you're watering as you're adding each layer of your pile and you're building it. Make sure you're watering it then and not watering at the very end. In the end, you want your pile to be about the consistency of a wrung out sponge. So if I was to take my hand right now and squish it, you would see some moisture come out, but it wouldn't be dripping, but it would be enough that you could feel about the consistency of if that pile of compost was about the same as a wrung out sponge. So that's really what you're in order for hot compost to keep going, you need to make sure that bin is that water is consistency is about that of a wrung out sponge. Okay, let's go into finished compost. Our other #1 question we get a lot of is, when do I know when it's finished? So at one point in time, though, if you want finished compost to happen, you're eventually going to have to stop adding things to it. And so we're going to see, and when you decide when to stop, then after you stop adding material, and you could build another bin where you can add that material in, but eventually then you're going to have this pile where you're then going to decide when it's finished. And so we'll watch the video here and I'll explain a little bit more.
So this is finished compost. The only thing it needs here is it needs to be sifted. So because right now there's still some rocks in here, some larger materials that haven't been composted out yet. So, but for the most part, if you were to sift this out, ultimately you're going to get to compost that looks pretty nice, crumbly, sweet smelling. It doesn't stink, and this is what we call black gold. It's full of nutrients for the plants, and that can be easily incorporated out into the beds or into the lawn.
Okay, so let me go back to mine. Okay, so when you're determining finished compost, the more you're involved with it, the faster it will get finished. Again, if you're in no rush, it doesn't matter. You don't have to, there isn't a, like, oh, I need to be doing this. But if you really want finished compost within 4 to 6 months, then going out there and turning your pile at least once a week, make sure you're watering, and especially now you might have to check your pile at least twice a week during the hot summer months and less during the shoulder seasons. But making sure that that pile doesn't stall. And the reason why a pile stalls is that it's underwatered, or you don't have enough greens in it. So the nitrogen source has died out. And so because there isn't that nitrogen source of energy for that, those bacteria and organisms are going to go elsewhere. But initially, if you look at this, the more, for example, this is the temperature of the pile, and the hotter it gets, then the rate of decomposition happens like faster. So right now, if you're going out there and turning it every week or so, then if you're only out there every 30 days, it'll heat up a little bit, but then it kind of peters out the temperature. And what happens is it just takes longer to break down. If you're out there, turning that pile every 3 days, it's going to get super hot. And then eventually that stuff's going to break down very quickly. And then all of a sudden your temperature is going to drop and you're going to have finished compost faster. So ultimately, when you build a pile, you want those temperatures to spike more for quick compost. So that way then it finishes at those high degree temperatures, and then eventually it'll peter out here where then you'll end up having your finished compost quicker. So there is a rate of decomposition is based not only of the materials, but also your involvement in it. So traditionally in this, what's considered the hot phase, after initial mixing, the pile usually stays hot between 120 and 160 degrees for 3 to 6 weeks. And during that time frame, if it's in a bin, you're going to notice that pile will shrink in half. That is what's supposed to happen. We get a lot of questions about that in our question answer clinic about, whoa, my compost pile just shrunk. That's what's supposed to happen in a composting system, okay? So is it compost yet? One, these are the questions to ask. Is it no longer heats up when turned? So sometimes in the winter time, you can actually see the steam coming off of it, the heat. You could put your hand in there. You can also feel it. You know, you can definitely tell when the compost pile is still heating up and working. It looks dark, crumbly, and sweet smelling. That's another idea or another clue that, again, you're getting to the finished compost phase. And then ultimately, you need to let that pile sit for about 2 to 3 months. After you turn it and it doesn't heat up, then you're just going to let that pile sit for about 2 to 3 months. So that way it can cure and finish. And during that curing phase, it's only between 80 and 110 degrees. And what happens is at that point, it's just getting the right ratios of the nitrogen. So that way then it can be applied to your garden without any adverse effects. This entire process takes about 4 to 6 months. So the piles that you saw in the videos, we made those in March. And right now we're starting to see where there's still some of the bigger stick materials, and we had a lot of vines in there, which we tried to break up small enough, but still some bigger clumps happened. So we can see those bigger vine clumps that are still intact, but a lot of the other material in there has already started to break down. And that started from March, and so we're heading, you know, to this more towards the curing phase where it's breaking down, but at a less fast pace. So that's ultimately what you're working for. The reason why you, again, don't want to put in fresh, let's say, remember you're out there every week turning it, you're watering it, and then all of a sudden you want to put that finished compost on, let's say, a vegetable start. There's too much nitrogen in that compost because you didn't cure it, and it could actually burn the plant. So that's another reason why you want to make sure that your compost rests or cures. Questions?
We have some questions, but I want to check in on time, Cori.
Okay.
Should we keep moving, or do you want to take those questions?
What I don't have I apologize.
It's 12:52.
Okay. I think we only have a couple. Let me go. How about this? Let's go finish with the slides here, and then let's see if I can get into a couple more questions here. I think I'm at the end here. Okay. So yeah, harvesting compost. I'll just say the fact sheet that's on harvesting compost, as well as how to use compost, are part of a publication called Backyard Composting, and I'll show you where that is here. This tells you, again, how to use it. Another critical error that most folks have, in fact, so much that actually OSU ended up putting a publication last year about it, was how to actually use compost in gardens, because people were making it but not necessarily knowing how to apply it, and they were causing actually more damage in their beds by using it improperly. So this link will also be provided in the follow-up email, as well as the links to a few other composting resources here. If you have a current pile happening right now, I just want to mention a couple things you should be watching out for currently, right now, because this is what we just saw on our when we were there Monday at our garden. In that same publication I'm going to share with you, it has this chart. And it tells you if you're having these specific symptoms, it tells you what the problem is and then how to fix it. You can also email our question and answer clinic, and we can also help you through that. But this chart is located in that publication that we're going to send you that will help you with troubleshooting if you're having some problems with that. The other thing to be aware of right now is that you should be monitoring your piles for critters. In the summer dry months, you tend to have more flies and ants. If you have ants in your pile, that means your pile is too dry. So you want to make sure you water it, and when you water it, the ants will leave. Flies, if you open your bin, all of a sudden a plume of flies pop up. Put a wet layer of cardboard and keep that cardboard wet. And so that's another critical piece to the barrier to them laying eggs in your compost pile. Okay. Right now, typically we have more issues with mice and rats if you have a lot of vegetable scraps that are unprotected, like it's not in a bin, a secure bin. And then right now, snakes, we saw a couple snakes at our pile that were just warming themselves. Spiders are good. They actually eat a lot of the other critters that aren't necessarily good. So spiders, you want to keep them into your pile. Slugs and snails are happening. So, this is something to be looking for more towards August, September, October, really in there. Slugs will breed. We did see this happening on Monday. This picture actually was taken on Monday. These are two slugs breeding. And so what happens is they're going to lay eggs from this, and you don't want them to lay eggs in your pile, because then you'll take that finished compost and then you'll put it out in your yard, and now you've spread slug eggs all over your yard. So if you see slugs in your pile or little clusters of white eggs that are kind of look like tapioca pearls, you want to get rid of them. Drown them in a dish of soapy water is fine, and then that way you won't be having slug eggs in your compost that you're then going to spread out all over your yard. Mating happens, though, again, ramps up in late August, September, October, and early November for slugs. Those are the slugs that you're going to have next spring. So you want to make sure that you manage the population now in the fall so that you'll have less slugs in the spring. Okay, so we're going to get to questions here. I think we're just do resources. Yeah, so we're going to send you a resource list, link to our website that has a bunch of the plans on it and our publications. This is the main one that you want to, will be in your follow-up email that we'll send you as well. In here, it's got everything from how to build a pile to troubleshooting to curing your compost. It's a one-stop shop for backyard composting. And again, it's free. It's on our gardening.wsu.edu website, and there's literally hundreds of fact sheets about gardening practices. So I encourage you not only for compost, but to go there and check out other gardening topics. If you do vegetable gardening, there's an excellent vegetable gardening for Western Washington publication that's free, and it's all peer-reviewed, scientifically proven material to do well here in Washington. If you have questions, you can email us directly at our question and answer clinic. This is our email here, as well as go visit our demonstration gardens. As I said, right now, Closed Loop Park is the only one that is open to the public when the Waste and Recovery Center is open. Dirtworks is currently not open to the public. We hope to, again, work that out and be able to get some more workshops scheduled here in 2022. And then we also have our farmers market garden also there that also has examples more for gardening, but not necessarily composting. We just do worm composting down there. So thank you for your time today. And Jenny's going to wrap up with that, but let's see if there's any really quick questions that I could answer.
Yeah, one here, could you add fertilizer to help with nitrogen?
You do not want to add fertilizer to your compost pile. So using your just plain green materials like your spent vegetable leaves, things like that, you need food sources for those bacteria and fungus to actually process.
Okay.
So, yep.
And can you add worms to a hot method?
Yes,
Okay.
worms. Actually, if you do a hot composting method, you will find our native red wiggler, which is our normal worm that we use for a worm bin system. They will naturally be coming into your pile. And so you want to encourage them to stay. That's fine. At the end, when you're, the only thing we would say is that when you, let's say if your pile's finished and you're ready to sift it, that's when you have to watch when you put that finished compost into the sifter, is that you don't want to be careful and watch for worms and pull them out. So that way you're not grating them against the grate and actually killing them.